My name is Randy Bartlett. I'm Interagency Coordinator at the Hawaii Invasive Species Council, and our guest for our brown bag today is Kelsey Brock from the University of Hawaii Botany Department. And she's going to be talking to us about her Hawaii Alien Plant Informatics project. And I'll turn this over to Kelsey. Kelsey, take it away.
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks for being here or on the line to listen to me. So, as Randy said, I'm Kelsey Brock. I'm a PhD student at the University of Hawaii Manoa, working with Dr. Curtis Daylor. He's my advisor on this project that we've called the Hawaii Alien Plant Informatics, or HAPI project. And I think that, it doesn't hurt to emphasize that Hawaii has more reason than most to implement exceptional conservation strategies. And this is mostly owing to the fact that there's a huge, big blue ocean that prevented the colonization of many plant species. Just a few got through, and then they colonize, establish, and then speciate so that most of the species in Hawaii are endemic here, and they live nowhere else in the world. So we're just going to talk about native vascular plants in this slide, no other taxa. So just 90% of the flora, the native Hawaiian flora, is endemic, while only 10% is indigenous and is native outside of Hawaii as well. But unfortunately, we can't really think of the Hawaiian Islands as isolated like that anymore. That big oceanic barrier that helped generate all this unique biodiversity within Hawaii has been completely overcome by human transport. And so now the flora of the Hawaiian Islands looks like this, where over half of it is comprised of naturalized alien plants, and this smaller, more treasured chunk of the pie, the endemic taxa, is dwindled down to 44%. And then I should note that in this endemic chunk of the pie, I've included both species and subspecies. So if I was to remove the subspecies, it would be an even smaller chunk of the pie. And for the yellow naturalized chunk of the pie, I've tried to limit this to definitively naturalized species where our best data indicates that they are forming persistent, self-replacing populations outside of cultivation. If I were to, say, add some plants that are questionably naturalized or species that are potentially just starting to naturalize, the yellow chunk of the pie goes to 54%. And so, unfortunately, it looks like our treasured, endemic, unique part of the pie is ever dwindling. And yes, that's because there have been a few extinctions in that part of the pie. But the main take-home is that there are so many alien plants coming into the state, and so many of them naturalized, that we've now more than doubled the number of vascular plants that existed on Hawaii prior to human contact. And not only do alien plants dominate Hawaii's flora in terms of just raw numbers, but they also dominate it spatially. So our best estimates, it looks like 63% of Hawaii's land area is invaded by alien plants. So in this figure here, you can see that the yellowy green is the heavily disturbed or totally alien-dominated chunk of Hawaii, and the mid-green is the native alien mix. However, it's really important to note that there are still native-dominated stands. Oftentimes they exist at high elevations, and they house a lot of endangered species, so there's still lots to conserve. And I belabor the numbers and the types of species so much because I think that it reveals two very important things that affect how we manage biodiversity in Hawaii. The first is that it reveals that we live in a double hotspot. So our most unique and treasured endemic species that exist nowhere else in the world co-occur with species that can be thought of as common on a global scale. And so this is a figure on the left from Kier et al., published in 2009, that looks at endemic plant hotspots and has identified Hawaii as a hotspot. And then on the right that shows shows Hawaii as an alien plant hotspot 2 from a figure out of Dawson et al., published in 2017. And then the second thing that all these species numbers importantly points out to us is that the alien plant problem in Hawaii is fundamentally a biodiversity problem. So that is, it's a challenge that involves hundreds of species. And so if we focus only on the species that we know about, then we can potentially be ignoring hundreds of other potential threats. And so clearly some need to prioritize species exists in Hawaii. And so this is my best estimate of species that are naturalized or potentially naturalizing in Hawaii. So that number is 1,660, which is a pretty large number. But it gets more complicated when you consider that most of the management exists on an island-specific scale. And so then you have to recognize that each island contains a unique subset of aliens that vary in invasive behavior, and that each island-specific invasion that's occurred differs in its arrival time and whether its preferred habitat was available. And so if you're a invasive species manager, you have a lot of species to deal with. It's overwhelming. So you might have a handful of species that you know about, but you might be asking, I know these species are bad, but are they the worst ones? And can I feasibly do anything about that with the resources that I have? And so to answer that question, we kind of need to know at least a really rough estimate of a invasive species management strategy for all other species in your management area, even if that strategy is to do nothing or pass the buck to someone maybe down the road. And so in an ideal world, we would at least have enough data to make a combined estimate of a management strategy for every species invasion in the Hawaiian Islands, or at least the main Hawaiian Islands. But you can see that diversity adds up very quickly. So in order to do that, you'd have to add all the invasions from Kauai and Oahu, etc. And then that quickly adds up to 5,000 different alien plant invasions across the main Hawaiian island, requiring 5,000 different management strategies. So very quickly, we've gone beyond the point of just being able to rely on expert opinion. And so what we're proposing is to help solve this problem with a field of study called Biodiversity Informatics. And basically the foundation of this very new field is to just compile data and then structure it wisely, and then design decision-making tools with support from computer science methods. So I think that this approach allows us to kind of move away from that very standard model of invasive species management where you will detect a plant, you identify it, and then you figure out if it's invasive, and then you act on it, because we have too many species here to do that. So instead, I think this will help move us into a realm where, yes, we're identifying plants, we're tracking them, but then managers can actually go to a central data repository and help answer questions that would influence their management decisions and what actions they take and if they will take any action at all. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through the types of data we're compiling that feed into our database model for the Hawaii Alien Plant Informatics portal. So the first thing you have to do is just track species. So I've called this taxonomy and status data because you basically track species in two different steps. The first is to find the species, identify it, and then curate a checklist of species that hopefully keeps up with that very dynamic field of science that is systematics and taxonomy. And then the second step is that you have to periodically assess species to assign an invasion status. Like, is it in cultivation only? Is it just beginning to naturalize? Is it naturalized, or maybe it's even been eradicated? And the second type of ecological data, the second data pillar of our database model, is ecological data. So this pertains to a species biology. So things like habitat preference, invasive traits, and maybe invasion history. So if it's shown to have impacts elsewhere in the world. And this type of data is really important for assessing the risk and potential impacts of invasion. And the third data type is geospatial data. So this is data that documents population extent, terrain, landowners, whether your invasion occurs over private land or public land, and this is really important for figuring out the feasibility of tackling that invasion. And so the design for the HAPI portal is just to tie all of these data together and put them in one place so that they can be cross-referenced in a way that is meaningful, hopefully, to invasive plant managers and maybe even invasive plant researchers. And so I like this model because it says that if you improve this data quality and increase shareability between these three pillars of data, that you have the best chance of management success. And this model also allows us to see where if you're lacking in a certain data type, that you increase the chance of management failure. So in this scenario, we have geospatial data and ecological data, but I've grayed out the taxonomy and status data because that's lacking. And then you can see that you run the risk of targeting the wrong species in this case. So, for example, if you are tackling a species based on its invasive history of what it's done in Tahiti, but then you realize that you've identified your plant wrong here in Hawaii and that's no longer tied to that invasion history in Tahiti, then you've just potentially wasted resources. And the second scenario is where we have taxonomy and status data, as well as geospatial data, but we're lacking in ecological data. And in this case, we run the risk of targeting species with less impacts and then forego our ability to target species that really could cause a lot of damage. And then in this scenario, we have our taxonomy status data, we have ecological data, that's good, but we're lacking in our geospatial data. And then in this case, you risk pairing species with infeasible strategies because obviously we don't want to miss any opportunities to eradicate or even prevent plants from invading when we can still prevent that. But similarly, we don't want to mistakenly allocate the all of the resources to eradicating something that's past the point of no return, and instead we might want to assign a different management strategy, say maybe containment or biocontrol, which includes a different range of decision-making and a different approach to management. So that is our conceptual model or data platform. And I realize that wrapping your head around a database model is probably not the most entertaining thing, but I think that it's really important because it shows how the data talks to each other. And I think that this will thwart a lot of problems down the road that often plague biodiversity databases, where in the end you do all this work and invest this money to build a database, but then your platform isn't flexible enough and the right query buttons don't exist so that the managers can ask the right questions and get answers to them. Okay, so now to finally outline what we've been doing in the last year and a half. We've been building data infrastructure, but I should probably rephrase that to say that we've focused on strengthening existing data infrastructure. So this falls into three categories: improving data quality, compiling data, and then maintaining data sharing with the idea that this project will have some longevity to it, which we won't get into for this talk. Okay, so on the improving data quality front, we've mostly focused on our taxonomy and status data pillar. So right from the get-go, we partnered with the Bishop Museum because they do a really mean job of identifying plants and curating a checklist of naturalized species, and that forms a big chunk of the bedrock for this pillar. And it's amazing how important it is to have your taxonomy up to date and have a well-curated list, because in a database format, all of your data pivots around an identifier, and then that identifier is always a species name or some substitute for it. So super happy to have the Bishop Museum doing what they are doing. But then we're also integrating the tracking of two important categories of species that have been neglected. And so the first one is cultivated species. So our knowledge of what cultivated species exist in the state dates back to collection projects that existed 20 to 30 years ago. And so we don't really have a good idea of how many cultivated species we have and what they are. And so we're hoping to integrate that into the final HAPI data portal. And then the second thing we're tracking or providing the infrastructure to be enabled to track is extirpations or eradications. And so we've had people come up to us and talk about that they have suspected eradications, that they purposely tried to eradicate these invasive species, but nobody has reported a win such that it has been reflected on a checklist anywhere in Hawaii that I know of. And so we've been working on drafting a manuscript that outlines some guidelines that have been borrowed from the IUCN guidelines that are recommended for declaring native plants extinct, with the hopes that it will give them a little framework to help best estimate when things are eradicated, and then also assign some uncertainty to it, because one of the big problems is that people don't want to say things are eradicated because they feel like there's at least some possibility that it could still be there. But we, at the same time, need to track our successes so we can learn from those successes and have more of them. And then lastly, we've been applying international data standards and invasion frameworks, including this one here, the proposed Unified Framework for Biological Invasion by Blackburn et al. 2011. And so two manuscripts we're drafting out of this category is, one is a very focused local Hawaii guidelines that kind of aligns the terminology and the status tracking categories used in Hawaii to those standards used by the international community, and just helps data collectors statewide report the same data consistently so that it can be used in a database format like this. And then the second manuscript is just simply applying this proposed unified framework to the checklist of naturalized plants here in Hawaii. Okay, on the data compilation front, we've been compiling both geospatial and ecological data. So as far as geospatial data goes, I think our data set has about 250,000 lines of data in it, although that will invariably change as I clean out some of the bad data and get more data from other people. But that consists of digitized herbarium voucher data, data that's been shared to us by invasive species managers from controls and surveys. Also enthusiasts, mainly this iNaturalist app where people can take pictures of species, and then after some process it becomes a research grade occurrence. And then just gardens and horticulturalists who have checklists for us, we borrowed those. And then on the ecological data front, this is the hardest pillar to fill with good data, but luckily for us in Hawaii, we already have an ongoing project that consistently compiles ecological data, and that's the Hawaii Pacific Weed Risk Assessment. So the weed risk assessment is designed to assess risk of a plant becoming a weed, but because it's based on 49 questions about a species' biology, we can actually take those questions individually and integrate them into our platform so that they can be used more flexibly. And I'm also going to be doing some literature searches to help fill in this gap as well. Okay, so this is the HAPI data portal mockup. This is a mockup, so there's no clickability to it, but I am currently working on learning enough about web development to work on the front end to design this. And this is a design to show you an invasive plant manager in Kauai who is interested in, who has a grant for tackling fire-promoting species, but they also want those species to be limited in distribution so that they are potentially eradicable. So you can see that they've restricted their island to Kauai and their distribution class to 1, limited. And then they've also looked for populations that are hopefully not very well established. So in this case, they've specified 1980 and onwards as the first record of occurrence. And they have said, okay, I want all plants of all statuses, cultivated, naturalizing, naturalized, and I'll have all data. And then I want to sort that data based on species that have an answer yes to the WRA question, creates a fire hazard in natural habitats. And so the power of this portal is that it gives you both a mapping ability, so you can zoom out and address questions about the entire state, but you can also zoom into an island-specific level like I've done here, or you can even zoom into the watershed level. And it also produces a species list. And so that gives you at least like candidates for control maybe that you can investigate with the mapping tool. So I've clicked this Andropogon exemplii, which is a fake species I made up, and then it gives you the distribution for that species. And hopefully this will help people use existing data to say, okay, it looks like based on our best known data, we can maybe tackle this, or we can start doing surveys for eradication. Or based on the data we have now, this is very widespread. This probably needs a management plan beyond my funds at the moment. And that's it. So thank you everyone for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them.
Cool. Thanks, Kelsey.